I had been called many things in my 30 years. The Iron Duke, the coldest man in Marchmore, a block of granite in a good coat, and I had borne every one of them with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes his reputation to be armor rather than accusation. It is a comfortable thing, being feared. No one asks a feared man to dance. No one corners a feared man at supper and asks after his intentions, his income, or his heart. I had built that fortress stone by stone since my 23rd year, when I had very nearly given my name, my house, and what I then believed to be my whole capacity for feeling to a woman who wanted only the first two. I do not say this to excuse what I am about to confess of myself, only to explain it. A man who has been made a fool once by his own tenderness learns to distrust tenderness in general, and mistakes the habit of vigilance for the virtue of judgment. I had made that mistake for 7 years before I ever stood in the doorway of the Fenwick Assembly Rooms and looked across a floor crowded with country neighbors I did not know and did not particularly wish to. The woman who taught me the mistake was named Serena Vane, and I have found, in the years since, that I can speak of her plainly enough now that the wound has closed over, though it took a long while to reach that plainness. She was beautiful, clever in the particular way that London prizes cleverness, quick with a compliment, quicker still with the silence that lets a man believe he has earned it, and she made me, for 2 years together, believe myself loved in a manner I had never before been loved, nor troubled to imagine I might be, being a young duke more accustomed to being courted for his rank than cherished for himself. I discovered the truth of it by accident, in a letter never intended for my eyes, in which she confided to a friend, with a wit I had once admired and came thereafter to despise, how very easily a proud, lonely young man could be managed, provided one were patient enough to let him believe the managing was love. I did not weep over it, or rage, or do any of the things I imagine a more openly wounded man might have done. I simply closed a door within myself, quietly and with great thoroughness, and did not open it again for 7 years, believing the closing to be wisdom rather than the plain, ordinary fear it actually was. Marchmore, when I came to it that autumn, was as unlike London as any county in England could contrive to be. A modest, unfashionable stretch of hedgerow and gentle hill, its principal town scarcely large enough to merit the name, its society composed of half a dozen respectable families, who dined with one another in rotating order, and considered a new face, however unremarkable, the season's chief excitement. I had inherited Ashcombe Hall from my father some years before, and had visited it seldom, preferring the distractions of town to the quiet of a county where a duke's arrival was still, evidently, an event of consequence sufficient to fill the Fenwick Assembly Rooms to their modest capacity. My sister Beatrice had dragged me there, if the truth be told, though she would object to the word dragged, preferring persuaded, which is the word ladies use when they have simply refused to accept the word no. We were newly arrived at Ashcombe Hall for the autumn, and Beatrice, 3 years my junior and possessed of a friendliness I had never managed to inherit, had declared that a duke who shut himself up with his ledgers and his hounds for a whole season running was a duke inviting every manner of unkind speculation, and that the surest cure for speculation was to be seen smiling at a country dance. I had not smiled. I had stood against the wall with my arms folded, and my expression, I am told, arranged in something between disdain and death, and I had watched the good families of Marchmore circle the floor in their best gowns and their careful hopes, and I had thought, not for the first time, that I would rather be anywhere else in England. It was in that frame of mind, proud, weary, and entirely unprepared to be spoken to as anything other than a duke, that I first heard Miss Cassandra Wren laugh. I did not yet know her name. I knew only that the laugh came from a knot of young women near the punch table, and that it was not the practiced titter I had grown accustomed to in London drawing rooms, the laugh that women perform for a man's benefit, pitched to sound delighted and delightful in the same breath. This laugh was unguarded, a little too loud for the room, entirely without calculation, and it irritated me exceedingly, because it seemed to say that its owner had not the smallest idea that a duke was present, or that his presence ought to command some quieter, more deferential mood in the room. I turned to look, and found a young woman of middling height, dark-haired, dressed with the plain neatness of a family that mended before it replaced. Her face lit with an amusement she made no effort to disguise. Her eyes, I did not yet know they were the particular gray-green of a winter sea. I would learn that later, and come to think of little else. Bright with whatever jest had passed among her friends. She was not, by the strict accounting of the room, the handsomest woman present. That distinction belonged, by unanimous local opinion I gathered before the evening was half done, to her elder sister, a Miss Honora Wren, fair and serene and universally agreed to be an angel, set down among the Marchmore gentry by some clerical error of Providence. I confess I scarcely looked at Miss Honora Wren that night, or any night thereafter, though half the room seemed determined that I should. My eye kept returning, against my own inclination, to the sister who laughed too loud. "You are staring, Ashcombe," Beatrice murmured at my elbow, entirely too pleased with herself. "Shall I have you introduced?" "I am not staring. I am observing the room, which you insisted I attend." "You are observing one corner of the room with a fixedness that would alarm the young lady in question, were she to notice it, which I promise you she has not, being far too occupied laughing at something her friend has said. Shall I have you introduced?" "No." I said it with more force than the question warranted, and Beatrice, wise enough not to press a point when pressing it would only harden my resistance, said nothing further, only smiled in the manner of a sister who intends to raise the subject again before the night is through. She was not wrong to intend it. But it was not Beatrice who brought about the introduction. It was my own tongue, and my own pride. Doing the office no matchmaker could have managed half so well. I had gone out onto the terrace for air. The rooms were close, overheated by too many candles and too many bodies, and I had never learned the trick of enduring a crowded assembly without some retreat to breathe in, and I found, on returning, that my path back into the ballroom took me directly past the little group of young women I had been, in Beatrice's word, observing. I heard as I passed a fragment of their conversation, spoken in a voice I now knew to be Miss Wren's, low but not low enough. "And I am sure his grace finds the whole of Marchmore beneath his notice, Lucy, so you need not fear he shall ask you to dance. He has looked at no one all evening but the cornice." There was laughter, quickly smothered as her companions caught sight of me, and Miss Wren, following their startled glances, turned and saw me not 3 feet distant, close enough that there could be no doubt I had heard every word. I watched her face, and this, I think, was the moment I began, however unwillingly, to attend to her, for she did not color and look away, as any properly mortified young lady ought to have done. She lifted her chin very slightly, as though daring me to take offense, and said nothing at all, which was somehow worse, or better, than an apology. I ought to have let it pass. A gentleman does let such things pass. A duke, above all, has nothing to prove by taking notice of a country girl's impertinence. But I had endured a fortnight of Beatrice's persuading, and an evening of being examined by every mother in the room as though I were a horse at Tattersall's, and something in me, pride, I have since decided, wounded pride dressed up as wit, would not let the moment go by unanswered. "You are correct, miss." I paused, deliberately, to let my ignorance of her name stand as its own small unkindness. "Wren," she supplied, without flinching. "Cassandra Wren. Miss Wren, you are correct that I find little in Marchmore to arrest my notice. I confess I had begun to fear the whole evening would pass without incident until you were good enough to provide one. It was not well done of me. I knew it even as I said it, watched the words land and saw something flicker across her face that was not hurt, precisely, but was near enough to Hurt's cousin that I felt, for one unaccustomed instant, ashamed of myself. And then the flicker passed, and something harder and brighter took its place, and she looked at me the way one looks at a puzzle one has decided, on the spot, to solve out of sheer stubbornness. "How fortunate for you, your grace, that a duke need never provide his own entertainment, when the local peasantry may be relied upon to do it for him." Her voice was perfectly even, perfectly civil, and utterly without deference, though I confess I had not thought a man so occupied in staring at cornices would have attention to spare for what was said at the punch table. You must have very excellent hearing, for a man so determined to appear that he hears nothing. There was a small, appalled silence from her companions, who looked from her to me with the particular horror of young ladies watching a friend commit social suicide in real time. I did not, I am ashamed to say, feel horror. I felt, and I have turned this feeling over many times since, trying to name it honestly, something almost like relief. In 7 years no one had spoken to me without calculation. Every compliment I received in London was weighed for what it might purchase. Every smile came with its accounts already tallied behind it. This woman, this Parsons, no, I would learn later, this squire's second daughter with her mended gloves and her too loud laugh, had just insulted me to my face without the smallest apparent concern for what it might cost her, and had done it, moreover, with a turn of phrase clever enough that I found myself, absurdly, admiring the construction of the sentence even as I resented its content. "You are impertinent, Miss Wren. I have been called worse, your grace, generally by men with less reason to feel wounded by the truth. I am not wounded." "No," she agreed, with a small, infuriating smile. "I don't suppose you are. I don't suppose anything reaches you at all, up there among the cornices." And with that she dropped the smallest, most correctly measured curtsy I had ever received, a curtsy calibrated, I understood at once, to give me not one particle more courtesy than my rank strictly required, and not one particle less than good manners obliged her to, and returned to her friends, leaving me standing on the edge of the dance floor with the peculiar sensation of a man who has been thoroughly, deservedly, and rather enjoyably routed. I did not dance that evening. I told myself it was because I had never cared for country dances, which was true, and not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I spent the remainder of the assembly in a state of distraction I had not experienced since I was a very young man, watching a woman who was, by every rule I had been raised to value, entirely unsuitable, no fortune to speak of, a family whose land was mortgaged to the hedges, a father whose estate would pass, upon his death, to a cousin none of them had ever met, a laugh too loud and a tongue too sharp, and finding that I could not stop watching her, could not stop turning over her sentences in my mind to admire their construction, could not account for why a woman who had just insulted a duke to his face should occupy so very much of that duke's thoughts on the ride home. "You have been very quiet," Beatrice observed, from the opposite seat of the carriage, watching me with the particular alertness of a sister who suspects something interesting has occurred and means to have the whole of it before we reach the hall. "I am always quiet." "You are quiet in a different manner tonight. You are quiet the way you were quiet after the Ellersby wedding, when you had discovered Serena's letters." I stiffened, and Beatrice, seeing it, softened her voice at once, though she did not abandon the subject. "I do not mean it unkindly, Julian, only that you wear a particular face when something has struck near a nerve, and you wore it tonight, from the moment you came back in off the terrace. Nothing struck near any nerve. A country girl was impertinent to me, and I was, I confess, ungracious to her first, and the whole exchange is not worth another moment's consideration. What is her name?" I did not attend. "Julian." "Wren," I said, with as much indifference as I could manage, and was betrayed entirely by the fact that I remembered it without the smallest effort, when I could not have told her, at that moment, the name of a single other person present that evening. Beatrice smiled, the particular smile of a younger sister who has just found a thread she means to pull upon at length and at leisure, and said nothing more, which was, I have come to learn, always the more dangerous choice. It ought to have ended there. A single evening, a single sharp exchange, the sort of thing a man of my position might forget within the week, had circumstance been kinder, or had Marchmore been a larger county with more families to occupy my sister's determined hospitality. But Marchmore was small, and its families few, and its obligations, as I would discover over the following weeks, a great deal more binding than I had anticipated when I took up residence at Ashcombe Hall with the vague notion of overseeing my steward's autumn accounts and being troubled by no one. The first of these obligations arrived in the person of Mr. Frederick Hale, my closest friend since our Oxford days, who descended upon the hall a fortnight later with his usual cheerful disregard for whether he had been invited, and who had, within 3 days of his arrival, contrived to fall entirely and rather helplessly in love with Miss Honora Wren. She is an angel, Ashcombe. I mean it quite seriously. I have never in my life met a woman so entirely without artifice, so gentle, so— You met her 3 days ago, Hale, at a dinner where she said perhaps 11 words, all of them concerning the weather. And every one of them was perfect, he said, with the particular fervor of a man who has decided, against all evidence and all reason, that he is in love, and means to defend the decision to his last breath. "I mean to call upon the family tomorrow. You will come with me." I did not wish to go. I had, in the intervening weeks, made a private and entirely rational decision to think no further of Miss Cassandra Wren, a decision I had upheld with tolerable success except for the small matter of thinking of her constantly, turning over her sentences at odd hours, wondering, with an irritation I could not fully account for, whether she had found some other duke to insult in my absence, catching myself, twice, composing responses to remarks she had made a fortnight past, as though the conversation were not concluded but merely paused. I told myself this was resentment. I have since learned to call it by its proper name, but at the time I clung to resentment as the more dignified explanation, and resentment, being a passion nearly as consuming as its opposite, did not prevent me from accompanying Hale the following morning to Fenwick Grange, the modest, well-kept, visibly straightened house where the Wren family made their home. It was Mr. Wren himself who received us, a mild, stooped gentleman with ink-stained fingers and the harried courtesy of a man managing 5 daughters and a mortgage on very little income and considerable good humor, and it was in his small, book-crowded study, while Hale was borne off by Mrs. Wren to the drawing-room to be presented properly to Miss Honora, that I found myself, by no design of my own, briefly and unexpectedly alone with Miss Cassandra Wren, who had been dispatched to fetch a ledger her father wanted and who stopped, on finding me standing awkwardly amid the towering, precarious stacks of books that seemed to constitute Mr. Wren's principal furniture, with an expression of such open astonishment that I very nearly laughed, a thing I had not done, I realized with some surprise, in longer than I cared to calculate. "Your Grace," she recovered herself quickly, dropping the same precisely measured curtsy as before. "I did not know you were acquainted with my father." "I am not. My friend Hale is acquainted, or wishes to be, with your sister. I am merely accompanying him." "How very dutiful of you." Her tone made plain what she thought of the excuse, though she was too well bred, or too amused, to say so outright. "I confess I am surprised a man so occupied with cornices could spare the time. You have an excellent memory for insults, Miss Wren." "I have an excellent memory generally, Your Grace. It is one of the few luxuries available to a woman with no fortune. No one troubles to flatter my memory into forgetting, the way they flatter a rich woman's memory into forgetting every unkindness done her, provided the doer is sufficiently well connected." I ought to have been offended. I found, instead, that I was assembling, with something like eagerness, my reply. "And is that what you believe I did? An unkindness, sufficiently well connected to expect forgiveness?" "I believe you said what you believe to be true, Your Grace, which is that Marchmoor and its inhabitants are beneath your notice. I have simply declined to pretend I did not hear it, or to forgive it, merely because a duke said it. I find dukes are not on the whole accustomed to being disagreed with, and I confess I take a certain plain enjoyment in disagreeing with them." "You make a habit of it then, disagreeing with dukes." "You are the first I have had the opportunity to practice upon, Your Grace, but I find I have a natural aptitude." There was, beneath the tartness, something that might almost have been an invitation, not to flirtation precisely, for I do not think Cassandra Wren flirted, in the ordinary sense the word is used in London drawing rooms, where flirtation is a kind of commerce, each smile weighed against its likely return. This was something plainer and stranger, an invitation to speak honestly, to a woman who had made abundantly clear she would tolerate nothing less. I had not been spoken to honestly in longer than I could easily reckon. I found the sensation of it went to my head rather more than wine. "Then permit me to disagree with you in return, Miss Wren, on the matter of Marchmoor's being beneath my notice. I said what I said out of ill temper, having endured a fortnight of my sister's insistence that I attend a dance I had no wish to attend, and I said it, moreover, before you had given me the smallest reason to think better of the county or its inhabitants. Since that evening I have had considerable reason to revise my opinion, though I concede the revision has been forced upon me rather against my will, and by a source I did not expect." She looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, not softening, precisely, for Cassandra Wren was not a woman easily softened, but a recalibration, as though she were testing the weight of my words against her expectation of what a duke's words were generally worth, and finding, to her own visible surprise, that the scale did not tip quite where she had assumed it would. "That is either the nearest thing to an apology I have ever heard a duke attempt," she said slowly, "or the most elaborate insult, and I confess I cannot yet determine which. I confess I am not entirely certain myself, Miss Wren. You have that effect on a man's certainties, I begin to find." Whatever she might have answered was lost, for her father called for her from the passage, and she went, with a last unreadable look thrown over her shoulder, and I was left alone among the towering books with the very unducal sensation of a man whose careful, well-defended heart had just been dealt a blow he had not seen coming and could not, try as he might on the ride home, persuade himself he wished undealt. Hale, for his part, was insufferable the whole way back to the hall, full of Miss Honora's gentle voice and gentler eyes, and asked me twice why I was smiling, a question I answered both times by informing him I was not smiling, though Beatrice, when we returned, took one look at my face and said only, "Fenwick Grange, was it?" "How very dutiful of you both," in a tone that made abundantly clear she had drawn her own conclusions, and meant to see them proven before the season was out. The weeks that followed brought Hale to Fenwick Grange with a regularity that made pretense of business impossible, and brought me, therefore, into Cassandra Wren's company, with a frequency I had not anticipated and, I will own it now, though I did not own it then, had begun, in some quiet, unexamined corner of myself, to arrange my days around. We quarreled, that autumn, with a persistence that alarmed my sister and delighted, I think, Cassandra's younger sisters, who took to watching our exchanges the way one watches a particularly engaging game of cards, keeping some private tally, I later learned, of who had won the latest round, and betting, quite unashamedly, small sums of pin money upon the outcome. The sharpest of these early quarrels arose over the enclosure of the common land bordering Fenwick village, a matter on which I had, until that autumn, held opinions I had never troubled to examine closely, having absorbed them wholesale from my father's steward and every other landholder of my acquaintance, all of whom regarded enclosure as simple, sensible improvement, and the villagers' objections to it as sentiment unworthy of serious attention. I made the mistake of voicing this opinion, lightly and without much thought, over tea in the Wrens' small parlor one gray October afternoon, and was answered with a swiftness that left me in no doubt I had, once again, given Cassandra Wren precisely the opening she required. Sensible improvement, Your Grace? I wonder whether you have ever troubled to walk the common yourself, and speak to the families who graze their one cow there, or gather their firewood, or grow the few vegetables that keep a poor household from real want through the winter. I have walked it 100 times. I know the Hobbs family, who will lose the grazing that keeps their children in milk, and the widow Thorne, who has no other means of firing her hearth once the common wood is fenced away for a gentleman's improved pasture. You call it improvement because it improves your rents, Your Grace, not because it improves the lives of anyone who must actually live upon the land you propose to fence. You mistake me for a man with no sympathy for the poor, Miss Wren, when I have merely repeated an argument I have heard made by every serious agricultural improver in England, that enclosed land is better farmed, more productive, and ultimately of greater benefit to the whole parish, than land held in common and worked, by your own account, inefficiently by 100 small hands, rather than well by a few large ones. And I do not doubt you have heard it made, Your Grace, by improvers who stand to profit handsomely from the improving, and who have never once had to reckon what a cow and a strip of common firewood are worth to a family with no other cushion against a hard winter. You speak of efficiency as though it were the only value worth weighing. I would ask you to weigh, alongside it, whether a parish full of families reduced to the workhouse because their small independence has been fenced away from them is truly a more efficient parish than one where 100 families keep themselves, imperfectly but honestly, without becoming a charge upon anyone's charity. I found, turning her argument over in the silence that followed, for I had, for once, no ready reply, that I could not, in honesty, dismiss it as easily as I had intended to. I had never troubled to walk the common at Fenwick, nor at Ashcombe, nor at any of the half-dozen parishes where my own steward had lately been urging enclosure upon me as sound policy. I had accepted the argument because every man of my acquaintance accepted it, and because to question it would have required an effort of attention I had not, until that afternoon, troubled myself to spend. You have given me a great deal to consider, Miss Wren, I said at last, and watched surprise flicker across her face at an admission she had plainly not expected from me. I confess I had not looked closely enough at the matter to have earned the opinion I offered you so carelessly. I will walk the common myself before I instruct my steward further on the subject, and I will speak with the families whose interest in it I have, until this afternoon, given no serious thought to at all. You mean to actually do it, not merely say so to end an argument you have grown tired of losing. I have found, Miss Wren, that losing an argument to you is a considerably more instructive exercise than winning one against anybody else, and I do not say that lightly, nor to flatter you, for I do not think you would thank me for flattery in any case. She studied me a long moment, as though testing the sincerity of the claim against some private standard she had not yet fully disclosed to me, and then said, more gently than her usual tartness allowed, "No, I would not thank you for flattery, but I find I do not know quite what to do with plain sincerity from a duke either, having had so little occasion to practice receiving it." It was, I understood even then, as near as she had yet come to admitting that our quarrels had begun to mean something to her beyond the pleasure of a well-matched argument, and I carried the admission home with me that evening turned over and over, the way a man turns over a small, unexpected gift he has not yet decided how to properly value. I did walk the common the following week, and spoke with the Hobbs family and the widow Thorne, exactly as I had promised, and came away from the exercise with a considerably altered opinion of enclosure in general, and my own careless certainties in particular, an alteration I reported to Cassandra at our next meeting, with an honesty that plainly startled her, and which earned me, for the first time since our acquaintance began, something that was not quite a smile of triumph, but was very near its gentler cousin. We quarreled, too, over a novel she had read and I had dismissed unread, on the strength of its reviews, until she made me sit through an hour of her reading passages aloud in the Wrens' small parlor, her voice rising and falling with the drama of it, utterly unself-conscious, utterly absorbed, until I found I had stopped attending to the words at all, and was attending only to her, the particular way her hands moved when she was making a point she cared about, the color that came into her face when she was passionate rather than merely quarrelsome, The moment, near the novel's end, when her voice caught on some sentimental turn of plot and she looked up, half laughing at her own susceptibility, and caught me watching her with an expression I had not troubled to arrange into anything more guarded. "You are staring again, Your Grace." "I am observing the room, Miss Wren. You insisted I attend the reading." It was her own words, thrown back at her from that first evening, and I had the satisfaction, rare enough in our exchanges, of watching color rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the novel's plot, before she recovered herself and informed me, with great dignity, that a duke who could not attend to a novel without staring at its reader ought to confine himself to sermons, which required no imaginative sympathy whatsoever. I laughed. I had not meant to. It surprised me as much as it surprised her. A genuine, unguarded laugh, the first I could remember in longer than I wished to count, and I saw something shift in her face at the sound of it. Surprise. And beneath the surprise, something warmer, quickly suppressed, that I did not yet have the courage to name, though I turned it over for days afterward, the way a man turns over a coin whose value he suspects but has not yet had assayed. It was on one of these visits, while Hale sat in the Wrens' drawing room attempting, with the transparent clumsiness of a man too much in love to manage subtlety, to secure a moment alone with Honora, that I found myself deposited, by the general traffic of a crowded small house, in the garden with Cassandra's two youngest sisters, Delia and Frances, aged 15 and 13 respectively, who regarded me with the frank, unblinking curiosity of girls who had not yet learned that a duke was a creature one was meant to be intimidated by. "You argue with Cassandra a very great deal, Your Grace," Delia observed, with the particular bluntness of the very young. "Frances and I have kept a tally since the assembly. She has won 11 arguments and you have won 4, and 2 were called a draw because Mama came in before either of you could finish." "Delia," Frances hissed, mortified, "you are not to say such things to a duke." "Why not? He is only a man, whatever his title, and Cassandra says a title is no substitute for good sense, and that half the peerage would be considerably improved by losing an argument occasionally, since it is the only education some of them are ever likely to receive." I found I could not, in honesty, take offense at a sentiment I had come, over the preceding weeks, to privately share. "Your sister is a very astute observer of the peerage, Miss Delia, and I confess I count myself fortunate to have provided her with material for study." "You are not at all what we expected. When Cassandra came home from the assembly and told us she had insulted a duke and did not regret it in the smallest degree," Frances said, more shyly than her sister, though with no less candor, "we expected you to be dreadful. Cassandra said you had the manner of a man who had swallowed his own walking stick." I believe I did, rather, at the time. I have had cause since to reconsider my posture. "Because of Cassandra," Delia said, with the flat, satisfied certainty of a younger sister who has drawn her own conclusions and does not require confirmation to hold them absolutely. "You needn't look so alarmed, Your Grace. We shan't tell her you turned quite that color when I said her name, but we are very fond of her, and she has had rather a hard time of it, being the clever one instead of the pretty one, which people are apt to forget matters just as much, and we should like very much for someone finally to notice." "I have noticed," I said, and found the admission, offered to a girl of 15 in a modest kitchen garden, considerably easier than any I had yet managed to Cassandra herself. "I have noticed a very great deal, Miss Delia, and I mean to go on noticing, if your sister will permit it." Delia looked satisfied in the manner of a general who has secured an important concession, and Frances, blushing furiously on her sister's behalf, dragged her off toward the kitchen garden's far hedge, before either of them could disgrace the family further, leaving me alone with the distinct and not unpleasant sensation of having been thoroughly assessed, and found, on balance, acceptable. It was Hale, that same afternoon, who provided the season's first proposal, though not without considerable assistance from myself, for I had contrived, on hearing of his intentions the previous evening, to keep Mr. Wren occupied over the estate accounts precisely long enough to grant my friend the quarter hour of privacy he required. I did not witness the proposal itself, propriety and my own tact both forbidding it, but I witnessed its immediate aftermath, when Hale came bursting into the study where I sat with Mr. Wren, his composure entirely abandoned, his face lit with an unguarded joy I had not seen in him since our Oxford days, to announce that Miss Honora Wren had done him the honor of accepting him, and that he was, without question, the most fortunate man in England. "You said the same of yourself a fortnight past, over a horse you had won at cards," I observed, though I clapped him on the shoulder with a warmth that belied the dryness of the remark, for I found I could not, that afternoon, begrudge any man his happiness, having so lately begun to hope for a portion of the same for myself. This is entirely different, Ashcombe, and you know it perfectly well, for I have watched you these 6 weeks looking at Miss Cassandra in precisely the manner I have been looking at Honora, and I have said nothing of it out of the goodness of my heart, though I confess it has cost me considerable restraint. I did not, of course, tell her any of this. Pride is a slow unlearning, and mine had 7 years of careful construction to undo. I continued to quarrel with her, continued to arrange business at Fenwick Grange that did not strictly require my presence, continued to watch for her at every gathering Marchmore's modest society offered, and continued, all the while, to tell myself that this was merely the natural consequence of finding, in an unpromising county, a mind sharp enough to occupy my own, as though a man's mind and a man's heart could be so neatly separated, as though I did not lie awake some nights composing arguments I intended to lose to her, on subjects I did not privately much care about, for the sole pleasure of hearing her demolish them. It was in that season, some 4 weeks after our first quarrel, and long before I had permitted myself to name what I felt for her, that I made the mistake of inviting my cousin Lady Prudence Ashworth to Ashcombe Hall, a decision I have regretted more thoroughly than any other of that autumn, save perhaps my original unkindness at the assembly. Prudence was the widow of a baronet, distantly connected to my father's family, and possessed of the particular species of pride that afflicts those whose claim to consequence is thin enough to require constant, vigorous defense. She arrived at the hall with 3 trunks, a great deal of advice on the management of my household that I had not solicited, and a settled conviction that the Wren family, whom she had heard of before she had met them, were precisely the sort of encroaching country nobodies a duke's cousin was duty-bound to discourage. I had arranged, in the week of her visit, a small gathering at the hall, nothing so grand as a proper house party, only an evening of cards and music, to which the principal families of Marchmore were bidden. Hale having by then all but installed himself as a fixture at Fenwick Grange, and having begged me, with the particular helplessness of a man deep in love, to see that the Wrens were included. I agreed readily enough, telling myself it was for Hale's sake, and knowing, in the honest part of myself I had not yet learned to consult often, that it was for my own. It began well enough. Cassandra came in a gown I had not seen before, pale blue and plainly made, and argued with the local vicar over some point of scripture with such good humor that even the vicar, a man not naturally inclined to be argued with, seemed to enjoy the exercise. I watched her from across the room with an attention I no longer troubled much to disguise, and thought, not for the first time, that I had never in London seen a woman command a room so entirely without appearing to try. It was over cards, later in the evening, that Prudence found her opening. She had been observing Cassandra for the better part of an hour with the narrowed, assessing look of a woman totting up another woman's worth in guineas, and when the hand ended and the table fell, for a moment, into the small idle chatter that fills the gaps between deals, she said, in a voice pitched to carry farther than idle chatter generally required, "You play remarkably well, Miss Wren, for a young woman who I understand has had so very little occasion for cards, or indeed for much society at all, given your family's circumstances. It is a wonder your father has managed to keep the roof over Fenwick Grange as long as he has, on so encumbered an estate. I confess I had heard the mortgage was quite alarming." The table went quiet. I saw Mrs. Wren's face go pale, saw Honora's hand still on her cards, saw the younger Wren girls exchange a look of stricken embarrassment on their sister's behalf, and I opened my mouth to intervene, to say something, anything, that might turn the moment aside, and found myself, in the same instant, oddly paralyzed by an old and ugly instinct, the 7-year habit of a man who had learned, after Serena, to let unpleasantness pass unremarked, rather than draw further attention to a wound already dealt, to retreat into the very coldness Cassandra had once accused me of, rather than risk exposing, before a room of watching neighbors, how very much the insult to her family had wounded me on her behalf. I hesitated. It was only a moment, no more than the space of a single indrawn breath, but Cassandra, who missed very little, saw the hesitation, and I watched something close in her face, before she had even opened her mouth to answer for herself. "My father's circumstances are no great secret in Marchmore, Lady Prudence," she said, and her voice was perfectly level, perfectly civil, and carried, beneath the civility, an edge I had heard turned upon myself once and had hoped, foolishly, never to hear turned upon anyone I cared for. "I am sorry if the subject alarms you. I find it does not alarm me half so much as it seems to alarm those who have never had to manage on less than they wished, and who therefore imagine want to be a species of moral failing rather than simple arithmetic. I assure you my father keeps his roof by considerably more diligence, and considerably less complaint, than many gentlemen of far greater fortune." It was, by any fair measure, a masterful reply, better than Prudence deserved, better than the room, for one embarrassed moment, seemed to know how to receive, and it ought to have ended the matter there. But Prudence, unaccustomed to being answered so directly by a woman she had judged beneath her notice, colored with an anger she did not trouble to disguise, and said, with a spite she made no further effort to soften, "I had heard you were sharp-tongued, Miss Wren. I collect I had not been told the whole of it. One wonders where a young woman in your position acquires the confidence to speak so freely in a duke's own drawing-room, when a little more humility might serve her family's interests rather better than her wit." I found my voice at last, too late by a full minute, and said, with what I intended as firm reproof, "That is quite enough, Prudence." But the words, when they came, felt thin against the damage already done, and I saw Cassandra register the delay, the fact that I had let a full exchange pass, had let her stand alone and answer for herself before I troubled to speak at all, with an expression I could not mistake for anything but hurt, quickly masked behind the same composed civility she had offered Prudence. She excused herself not long after, pleading a headache that convinced no one, and I did not have the chance, that evening, to say anything to her at all, for her family gathered her up with the swift, protective efficiency of a family well practiced in closing ranks around a wounded member, and were gone within the half-hour, leaving me standing in my own drawing-room, with my cousin's spite still hanging in the air, and a hollow, sick understanding, settling slowly and thoroughly through my chest, that I had failed her in precisely the manner she had once accused me of at our very first meeting, that I had let my own old caution, my own well-worn habit of retreating from unpleasantness rather than defending what I valued aloud, cost her the one thing I had promised myself, in the secret unspoken places of my own heart, that I would never again permit to be taken from her, the plain, public acknowledgement that she was worth defending. I called at Fenwick Grange the following morning, resolved to apologize, and was informed by a stiff, unhappy housemaid that Miss Cassandra was not receiving callers. I called again the day after, and received the same answer, delivered this time by Mrs. Wren herself, whose kindness toward me had visibly cooled, and who said, with the particular gentleness of a mother protecting a daughter she believed had been wounded by a man's careless silence, "She does not wish to see anyone at present, Your Grace. I hope you will understand that a family in our circumstances cannot afford to be made a public spectacle for the amusement of your relations, and that my daughter is entitled to a little time to recover her spirits after such an evening." I understood it entirely, and it was among the most miserable weeks of my life. I had spent 7 years believing that silence was safety, that a man who said little and felt less could not be wounded, and could not, therefore, wound others by the same careless mechanism. I had learned, over one dreadful sleepless week in early winter, that silence was not safety at all, that my silence in my own drawing-room had done Cassandra a harm I would have thought myself incapable of dealing her, and that the very habits I had built to protect myself from a repetition of Serena's betrayal had led me, with a cruel and perfect irony, into betraying the very woman Serena's ghost had taught me to guard against loving at all. It was Beatrice in the end, who told me plainly what I had lacked the courage to see for myself. "You did not defend her, Julian," she said, finding me one evening in my study, staring at a ledger I had not read a word of in an hour. "I watched your face. I know you love her. I have known it for weeks, longer perhaps than you have known it yourself, and I watched you hesitate, in your own house, while your cousin insulted her family to her face, and I understood, watching you, exactly what old wound had frozen your tongue. You are afraid, still, of what it costs a man to care aloud for someone. Serena taught you that caring aloud makes a man a fool, and you have spent 7 years unlearning very little of that lesson, however much you may have unlearned your coldness in every other particular. But Cassandra Wren is not Serena, Julian, and she does not need you silent to protect yourself. She needs you loud, and imperfect, and entirely on her side, in front of the whole watching world if it comes to that. For that is the only kind of love that would ever satisfy a woman who has spent her whole life being underestimated, and has never once, in my observation, been willing to accept less than the whole truth from anyone. I did not sleep that night either, but I rode to Fenwick Grange the following morning with a resolve I had not felt since, I could not, in honesty, recall feeling it before at all, not with Serena, not with anyone, and when the housemaid began once more to inform me that Miss Cassandra was not receiving, I asked, instead, whether I might speak with her in the garden, where propriety could not object to a brief exchange conducted within sight of the house, and where I did not intend to leave until I had said what I had come to say. She came out to me after some minutes, wrapped against the cold in a cloak too thin for the season, her face composed into the particular careful neutrality I had come to recognize as her armor, the mirror of my own, and I understood, looking at her, that whatever I said next would either begin to dismantle that armor or fix it permanently in place, and that I had no one to blame but myself for having taught her, by my silence, that it was needed. I hesitated, I said, before she could speak, Before my own courage could fail me, as it had failed me in the drawing room, I hesitated before I defended you, and the hesitation cost you a wound I had no right to let you bear alone, and I have spent every hour since trying to understand why, and I find I owe you the whole ugly truth of it, if you will permit me to give it. 7 years ago I was engaged to a woman named Serena Vane, who wanted my title and my fortune and was clever enough to make the wanting look, for 2 years, like love. When I discovered the truth of it, and I discovered it in the cruelest possible way, in a letter never meant for my eyes, in which she laughed with a friend over how easily I had been managed, I did not merely lose a fiancé. I lost, I think, my whole capacity to trust that any warmth shown me was warmth honestly meant, and I built, in the years since, a wall of coldness and silence I told myself was wisdom, and was only ever fear. When Prudence spoke as she did in my own drawing room, some old cowardly part of me, the part Serena taught me to protect above every other part, flinched from drawing attention to how very much I cared what was said of you, because to defend you loudly would have been to confess, before a room of watching neighbors, that you had become the person whose good opinion and whose safety mattered to me more than my own composure, and I was afraid, God help me, of what that confession might cost me, even though I have known for weeks that I love you beyond anything I have ever felt for another living soul. I failed you in that hesitation, Cassandra, and I understand entirely if you cannot forgive it easily, but I could not let another day pass without telling you the whole truth of why it happened, and without telling you that it will not happen again. That whatever fear Serena left in me, I choose you over it, plainly and loudly and in front of the whole of Marchmore, if that is what it takes to prove it. She was quiet for a long moment, the cold wind moving the bare branches above us, and when she spoke at last her voice was unsteady in a way I had never heard from her before, all her customary armor set aside. I have spent my whole life being the sister no one troubled to look at twice, Julian, the plain one, the sharp-tongued one, the one it was safe to overlook because Honora's beauty gave the family somewhere better to spend its hopes. I built my own wit as my own kind of armor, long before I ever met you, because a girl who makes herself clever enough to be feared a little is a girl who cannot be dismissed quite so easily as a girl who is only quiet and pretty and waits to be noticed. When your cousin spoke as she did, I did not need you to save me from her. I have been defending myself against exactly that species of unkindness my whole life, and I am tolerably good at it, as you well know, but I needed you to want to, Julian. I needed to see, in that moment, that I had stopped being merely an amusement to you, a clever novelty to occupy an idle autumn, and had become someone you would choose to stand beside publicly, cost what it might. Your silence did not merely fail to defend me. It confirmed the oldest fear I carry, which is that a woman without fortune or beauty enough to matter is a woman men will admire privately and abandon publicly. The moment admiring her aloud becomes inconvenient. You have never once been an amusement to me, I said, and found my own voice breaking on the words in a manner I had not permitted myself in 7 long years. You are the first honest thing that has happened to me since I was 23 years old, and I would rather stand beside you in front of every duchess and every cousin and every drawing room in England, and be thought a fool for it, than spend 1 more hour pretending a caution I no longer feel. I love you, Cassandra, not privately, not conveniently, not on terms that cost me nothing. I love you loudly, and I am done being ashamed of how much it shows. She looked at me a long moment more, searching my face for whatever proof she needed, and I let her search it, offering nothing guarded in return, until at last something in her own careful expression gave way, and she said, low and unsteady, "Then you had better prove it, Your Grace, and soon, for I find I have grown considerably too fond of you to go on pretending I have not." And I felt, hearing it, the last cold stone of 7 years' careful building come away at once, leaving nothing behind it but the plain, terrifying, wonderful fact of loving her, entirely, in the open air, where anyone might see. Word of our understanding, for an understanding it plainly was, though nothing so formal as a proposal had yet passed between us, could not long stay private in a county as small as Marchmore, and within the week Beatrice had contrived, with the particular satisfaction of a sister whose long patience has finally been rewarded, a proper dinner at Ashcombe Hall to which the whole Wren family were bidden, ostensibly to celebrate Hale's own imminent engagement to Honora, and rather more truly, I understood perfectly well, to give me the occasion I still lacked the composure to arrange for myself. It was, by any measure, a successful evening. Hale sat beside Honora and conducted himself with the besotted devotion of a man 3 weeks from proposing, which he did, in fact, do the following month. The younger Wren girls charmed the company with an unaffected liveliness that even I, watching for it, could find no fault in. And Cassandra, I had by then permitted myself the private liberty of her Christian name, though I had used it aloud only that once, in the cold of her mother's garden, sat across the table from me in a gown of pale green that made her eyes seem greener still, and argued with a visiting magistrate about the poor laws with such fire and such precision that I found myself, not for the first time, entirely unable to attend to anything else in the room. It was after dinner, when the company had withdrawn to the drawing room and the magistrate had cornered Mr. Wren over some point of local law, that I found the chance I had been watching for all evening to secure. A moment alone with Cassandra near the tall windows that looked out over the darkening park, the candlelight behind us throwing our reflections faintly against the glass. "You were very fierce tonight, Miss Wren, on the subject of the poor laws." "I am always fierce on subjects I care about, Your Grace. You have had 2 months to observe as much, and one very cold afternoon in my mother's garden besides." "I have. It is, I confess, among the things I have come most to admire in you." I had not meant to sound so grave, but the words were out before caution could catch them, and I watched her face still, the teasing light in her eyes giving way to something more careful, more attentive, as though she understood, before I had said another word, precisely what was coming. "You admire fierceness, Your Grace. I had understood dukes to prefer their women decorative and agreeable. I have found decorative and agreeable women considerably less interesting than I once believed them to be. I have found, in fact, that I would rather be disagreed with by you than agreed with by anyone else in England, and I did not come to that conclusion easily, nor quickly, but I have come to it entirely, and I do not intend to spend one more evening pretending otherwise before this room, or any other." I turned to face her fully, my heart beating with an unsteadiness I had not experienced since I was a very young man, long before Serena, long before the armor I had built around whatever capacity for feeling I still possessed. "I told you, in your mother's garden, that I loved you loudly now, and meant it. I find the words bear repeating in a warmer room, before witnesses enough that neither of us may ever again mistake my meaning for mere private sentiment. I love you, Cassandra Wren, entirely and without any further caution I intend to observe." She was quiet a moment, and I watched her throat move as she swallowed, watched the last careful guardedness in her face give way entirely to something unguarded and warm, though her eyes still held the particular bright challenge I had come, by then, to love above every other expression I had ever seen a woman wear. "That is a very handsome declaration, Your Grace, for a man who once informed me that Marchmore and all its inhabitants were beneath his notice. I have revised my opinion of Marchmore considerably since, Miss Wren, on the strength of one particular inhabitant's insistence on proving me wrong at every turn." I paused, and made myself say the rest plainly, without the shelter of wit to soften it, for I had learned enough that autumn to know that shelter was precisely what she deserved never to need from me again. "I am asking you to marry me, Cassandra, not as a duke condescending to a country gentleman's daughter, and not as a man merely grateful to have been humbled out of his own pride, though I own I am both grateful and humbled. I am asking you as a man who has never once, in the whole of his life, wanted anything so entirely as he wants you beside him, arguing with him, correcting him, refusing to let him retreat into silence when silence would be easier, for whatever years remained to either of us." She was quiet a long moment, her eyes bright in the candlelight, the teasing readiness I had come to love warring visibly with something graver beneath it, and when she spoke at last her voice, though still touched with her old wit, was unsteady in a way I had not yet heard from her even in the garden. "You do not do things by half measures, Your Grace, once you have finally decided to do them at all. I begin to think it took a great deal more courage for you to say that plainly than it would have taken you to dress it up in some clever turn of phrase, and I find I love you rather more for the plainness of it than I would have for any amount of cleverness." "Then say yes, and spare me the suspense a moment longer. I confess my composure is not so restored as I would like you to believe." "I have not finished, Your Grace." But she was smiling now, the last of the graveness giving way entirely to something so open and so warm that I felt the whole cold architecture of 7 careful years give way at once, like ice breaking on a river in the first true thaw of spring. "I wish you to understand that I do not surrender my opinions easily, and I have no intention of becoming decorative or agreeable, merely because you have asked it of me. I have not, in fact, noticed that you have asked it of me at all, which is, I begin to think, the whole reason I find myself so entirely undone by you. You have never once asked me to be less than I am. You have only argued with me, quite fiercely, as though my being fully myself were the very thing you valued, rather than an obstacle to be managed. I do not know that I have ever been loved that way before. I am not entirely certain I know how to receive it gracefully." "You need not receive it gracefully. I have found, on the whole, that I prefer you fierce." She laughed then, the same unguarded, too loud laugh that had first arrested my attention across a crowded ballroom, and I thought, hearing it, that I would spend whatever years remained to me, contriving to hear it as often as I possibly could. Then you had better let me finish accepting you properly, Your Grace, and be prepared for a fierce answer, for I warn you I intend to negotiate the terms. Negotiate the terms of a proposal already made, Miss Wren. I have watched you negotiate half the boundary disputes in Marchmoor this autumn, Your Grace, generally to your own considerable advantage. You cannot expect me to enter into so significant an arrangement without securing my own interests first. I had not laughed so freely in 7 years, and I did not attempt to suppress it now, there by the tall windows with the candlelight warm behind us and the whole watching room, for once, entirely forgotten. Name your terms, then, and I shall do my best to meet them, though I warn you I am a hard bargainer myself. I require, she said, ticking the points off with mock solemnity on her fingers, that you continue to argue with me on every subject on which we disagree, and that you never once expect me to yield merely because you are a duke. I require that you permit me my opinions on the poor laws, the enclosure of common land, and the general folly of men who believe a title confers wisdom along with rank. I require that you laugh, properly laugh, as you did just now, at least once in every week for the whole of our lives together, for I have decided it suits you far better than the cornice staring you were so devoted to when first we met. And I require, and here her voice softened, losing its teasing edge entirely, that you never again doubt, as I think some old wound has taught you to doubt, that when I say I love you, I say it because it is true, and not because there is any title or fortune in it I might otherwise have wanted. I accept every term, I said, and found my own voice unsteady with an emotion I had spent 7 years training myself never to show, though I would add one condition of my own, if you will permit it. Name it. That you marry me, not merely negotiate the abstract principle of it, but marry me, in fact, at the earliest date your father and the church will permit, for I find I have wasted a great deal of time being proud and cold and cornice-fixated, when I might have spent it, instead, being happy. She did not answer in words. She answered by placing her hand in mine. The first time I realized with a small shock that I had touched her at all in the whole 6 weeks of our acquaintance, for I had been too careful, too proud, too afraid of what my own want might reveal, to risk so much as a hand-clasp before that night, and I felt the whole of my careful, guarded heart open at the simple warmth of her fingers closing around mine, and understood, standing there with the candlelight in the dark park beyond the glass, that I had been mistaken, all those years, in believing pride to be armor. Pride had only ever been a wall I built to keep out the very thing that might have healed me, and it had taken a country squire's daughter with a mended glove and an unguarded laugh to show me the wall could be pulled down, stone by stone, and something better built in its place. Word of our engagement reached Prudence before I had troubled myself to send it, delivered, I do not doubt, by some Marchmoor acquaintance eager to see how the Duke's proud cousin would receive the news that the sharp-tongued Miss Wren was to become a duchess after all. Prudence's letter, when it came, was a masterpiece of grudging civility, offering congratulations she plainly did not feel, and hoping, in a line I read aloud to Cassandra with no small satisfaction, that, dear Cassandra will find the duties of so exalted a position within her compass, whatever her want of early advantages. Cassandra laughed until she had to set the letter down, and then took up her pen and answered it herself, in terms so perfectly, devastatingly courteous, that Prudence did not trouble either of us with her opinions again, and I understood, reading the reply over her shoulder, that I had chosen a duchess entirely capable of managing every drawing-room in England, without the smallest assistance from her husband's rank. We were married the following spring, at the small stone church in Fenwick Village rather than in London, for Cassandra declared she had no wish to be married among strangers who cared more for my title than for either of us, and I found, on being consulted, that I agreed with her entirely, as I had come to agree with her on nearly every matter that counted. Hale and Honora were married the same fortnight, in the same small church, in a double celebration that gave the whole of Marchmoor cause to declare it had never witnessed so fine a spring, and I confess I did not argue the point, though I privately thought the fineness of the season had a good deal less to do with the weather than with the particular felicity of the two households concerned. I stood at the altar that morning with a steadiness I had not expected to feel, given how thoroughly Cassandra had, over the preceding months, dismantled every careful certainty I had built my life upon, and watched her come toward me down the aisle in a gown her mother and sisters had sewn between them through the long winter evenings, plain in its material and unmatched, to my eye, by anything London's finest modiste might have produced. Her father gave her hand into mine with a look that mingled pride and something very near disbelief, as though he still could not quite credit that the daughter he had once gently despaired of ever seeing settled. Too clever, he had told me once, laughing, to be easily pleased by any suitor Marchmore was likely to produce, had contrived, in the end, to unsettle a duke so thoroughly that he had come, of his own accord and against every habit of 7 guarded years, to beg for her hand in his own drawing-room before witnesses. The whole of Marchmore turned out to see it. The same neighbors who had watched us quarrel across a dance floor that first autumn evening, who had whispered and speculated through every subsequent gathering, now watched us married with a satisfaction so evident it was very nearly smug, as though the whole county had long ago concluded what it had taken its own duke considerably longer to discover for himself. Beatrice wept through the whole ceremony, unashamedly, and told me afterward, at the wedding breakfast, that she had never in her life been so pleased to have been proved right about anything, a claim to which I offered no dispute, for she had indeed been right, and had been kind enough, moreover, to go on being right quietly, in the background, without once claiming the credit her patience had earned her. Even Prudence attended in the end, having judged it wiser to be seen offering her blessing in person than to be talked of as the cousin who had absented herself from a duke's wedding out of pique, and I confess I found a certain private satisfaction in watching her curtsy to the new duchess with a civility she could not entirely disguise as reluctant. Delia and Frances stood among the wedding party in matching blue, and informed everyone within earshot, with the solemn self-importance of girls who considered themselves largely responsible for the match, that they had known how it would end from the very first evening, tally or no tally, and that any sensible, observant person might have seen it coming from the very start, had they only troubled to watch how very much the Duke stared at their sister across a crowded, candle-lit room. It was Beatrice, too, who told me, some weeks into our marriage, that she had written privately to an old friend in London to make plain that the Duke of Ashcombe's new duchess was a woman of uncommon wit and uncommon courage, and that any drawing-room foolish enough to slight her would very shortly find itself without a duke's custom at all, a piece of quiet loyalty I did not learn of until long afterward, and which moved me, when I did learn of it, rather more than I knew how to say aloud. Our early married life at Ashcombe Hall was not without its quarrels, for Cassandra had promised me nothing else, and kept that promise as faithfully as any vow exchanged before the altar. We disagreed over the management of the tenant cottages, over the education to be given any daughters Providence might send us, over whether a duchess ought to involve herself so directly in the parish poor relief as Cassandra insisted upon doing, riding out herself in all weathers to see accounts kept honestly, and no family left to suffer for a steward's negligence. I lost most of these arguments, and came, in time, to be glad of the losing, for I had married a woman whose judgment I had learned, over one transformative autumn, to trust above my own, and I found a peculiar hard-won peace in ceding ground to a mind I had once been too proud to credit with any authority over my own opinions at all. I think of that first evening often, still, the assembly rooms too warm, the candles guttering, and a young woman's unguarded laugh cutting across a crowded floor, to arrest the attention of a man who had believed himself, until that moment, entirely beyond arresting. I had built my armor carefully, over 7 long years, believing myself wiser for the building of it. It took Cassandra Wren the better part of a single autumn to prove me wrong, and I have never in the years since found cause to regret the proving. She argues with me still, on every subject she cares about, and I have come to understand that her fierce, unguarded honesty is not the opposite of tenderness, as I once mistook it to be, but its truest and rarest form, the only kind of love, I have since decided, worth a man's whole heart, given without calculation, and received, at last, without fear. I was the coldest man in 3 counties, once, and utterly certain of it. I am grateful, beyond any words I have ever learned to speak plainly, that a woman too honest to flatter a duke, and too proud to be silenced by one, was patient enough to prove me wrong. Delia and Frances still keep their tally, I am told, though the arguments they now record are conducted across a nursery rather than a drawing-room, and concern matters a great deal smaller than the enclosure of common land, whether a second pudding is owed for good behavior, whether a wooden horse belongs by rights to the elder or the younger of our own 2 children, whether their Aunt Cassandra or their uncle the Duke is to be believed on some small disputed point of nursery law. I lose those arguments as readily as I lost the larger ones, and find myself no less content for the losing. A man who spends 7 years believing silence to be his fortress learns, if he is fortunate enough to be undone by the right woman, that the truest fortress a heart can build is not silence at all, but a marriage in which nothing need ever be hidden, argued over though it may be, from one evening to the next, for the whole of a lifetime.